to item number 12 on the agenda, just to advise that we have also received an apology from Greg Sayers, and to note that the apology from Councillor Quacks is now simply for lateness.
Well, it
welcome,
always
Councillor
was. It always was, yeah.
Oh, okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah, it should have always been.
I'd been advised to the contrary, but
Yeah,
good to see you here, Councillor. And that leads me directly to item 12, because Councillor Quacks was on the chair of the hearing panel. But can I ask officials, please, to come to the table? Belinda Hanson, team leader. Thank you very much. And I also note that Councillor member Glenn Wilcox is
only
has been
7/10 of him, of course.
yeah, well, we'll want 100% contribution, even if it's only 7/10 of the pay, Glenn. So if I could ask Belinda, please, to lead off, and then perhaps invite Councillor Quacks to make comment, followed by member. Right, please.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'll just introduce, this is Catherine Temple, Senior Policy Analyst in my team that's been leading this piece of work along with the hearings panel, so supporting the hearings panel. So really just to introduce that this is a report from the hearings panel recommending that the governing body make a new bylaw to regulate indoor domestic fires. And the bylaw would re-establish the rules from the former regional plan that has expired now that we have the unitary plan in place. So over to the chair of the hearings panel, Councillor Quacks, to introduce the item.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thanks, Belinda. Councillor Quacks.
Thank you. First of all, I guess I'd like to move the motion here on the board.
I'll second it.
Yep.
Yeah. And look, I just I want to thank my fellow panel members, Councillor Hulse and Councillor and Member Wilcox, and the staff for their hard work and their very pragmatic work and approach to this bylaw. I think there was some fear among some people that people would be told to get rid of their old wood burners or their old fireplaces. While that was, I guess that was one or two submissions supported that or talked about that approach. It was never intended that that would occur. So I do want to thank those members of the panel, particularly, and the staff. I guess that any technical questions that need to be answered can be answered by Belinda or Catherine.
Thank you, Councillor. Member Wilcox, would you like to contribute anything further to that?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I suppose in doing this bylaw, we must recognise that the warmth and ability to keep oneself comfortable in cold climes is a basic human right. Air quality, however, has a modi, and fires in Auckland and domestic fires is really a seasonal kaupapa that begins about now. Our air quality is largely, for most of the year, determined by transport, and it's transport related. However, I suppose I have to say that our air quality won't be determined by bylaws. It'll be achieved by an awareness that we're a part of a community. And that's what this bylaw sets out to do, is lay a standard for others to achieve, and that to understand that as a consequence of everyone's actions, we can make a better community. I don't think this is a tool to whack people over the head with, but it's a tool to remind people of their community obligations, especially in wintertime. So, like I said, I don't see this as being the end game, but it's a start. So, mātua.
Thank you very much for that, Member Wilcox. I've got a list of councillors wanting to contribute. Can I just take the questions first? I presume that the people have signalled have got questions, starting with Councillor Darby, Chris Darby.
Thank you, and thanks, Belinda, for your work here. How did the framing of this bylaw take into account council's CO2 emission reduction targets? Did it reflect those? Did it take those into account?
CO2 emissions.
Through the chair, yes.
Catherine.
Yes, we are aware of the low carbon plan Auckland Council had in place for a number of years, and I believe it's also been reviewed. So we're aware that the carbon emissions is an issue. The main focus of this bylaw is that if we're putting back in place the rules in the former regional plan, how we can minimise smoke and contaminants within that framework. Some of the submissions actually noted that burning wood actually there was some noting about the carbon emissions issue, but it wasn't the primary focus of this bylaw to address that particular issue. But going forward with the longer term air quality, positions as the council develops them, then we need to hook in with that.
Okay, so I'll just run through a few questions rather than
further questions.
One by one. So is Auckland's air quality likely to improve by this bylaw? Are you likely to address the purpose in any a considerable way or not? And how many premature deaths attributed to domestic fires are there likely to be, in terms of difference, is the number likely to drop compared with the current number? And you might like to remind us of the number of premature deaths attributed to domestic fires in Auckland, as the Auckland Regional Public Health Service has reminded us. So what is the difference going to be?
Through the chair, the advice provided to the hearing panel was that as part of the hearings was that, and it is well documented, that at the moment, with the current levels of particulates in the Auckland urban airshed, there are 110 premature deaths associated with domestic fires, about an equivalent amount from transport. In terms of what the bylaw is aiming to do, it's to maintain existing air quality.
Which is killing 110 people.
Yes, but what the bylaw does, as did the former regional plan, because new fireplaces going in have to meet higher technical standards, there is a gradual and incremental increase in air quality that is a reduction in particulates in Auckland, as has been the case for the last 20 years. So our bylaw is trying to reinforce that trend, but at this stage it doesn't include any additional measures, any additional measures to aggressively approach that issue.
Perhaps if I could add to that, Mr. Chairman, the panel, while those issues were raised, the panel was very mindful of the fact that for many, many people, open fires and old wood-burning fires are the only and most practical and in most cases the most economical way of heating their homes. And in fact, we had to weigh up whether it was much more of a detriment to health to have people deprived of heating than perhaps the other issue of particulates in the air. And as the officers have rightly pointed out, over a period of time through natural attrition, there will be a better air quality as old fires go out of commission and new fires are added.
So just our last questions are on
further question,
on
Councillor
coal,
Darby.
and it's sulphur related. Thank you, Mr. Chair. It continues to be allowed to burn coal in this bylaw as long as it has a sulphur content of no more than 0.5%. Can you tell me, in the retailing of coal in Auckland, is there any marking on the retail bags of the sulphur content of coal? And have you consulted the industry, that is the producers and the sources of coal that goes into the Auckland market? Is it bituminous coal, is it sub-bituminous, or is it lignite? And what is the sulphur content of coal that's reaching the domestic market in Auckland?
Through the chair, I can't actually answer those questions in any detail. To be honest, as part of the implementation, one of those issues we may need to look at in terms of applying the bylaw, ensuring that measures are in place to ensure that standard is met, including working with the industry. So that's something that we need to ensure happens, whether it's working with industry, and that's, going forward, we'll need to make sure that coal that is sold in Auckland does meet that standard. And similarly, that wood that is sold is and the wood that people use is dry wood and so on. We need to continue working on those issues.
So how do we arrive at 0.5% when most coals are higher than that, and only lignite, and lignite mostly comes from the South Island? How did we arrive at that if we didn't discuss that with the industry?
Through the chair, the advice that we were given as part of the project work was that is the standard that was in the former regional plan. The mandate for the bylaw was to replicate those standards, so we have done that. There has been, there were submissions to the hearing panel through the process about, well, maybe that's one thing that should be eliminated entirely. That was raised by submitters, and maybe in the future that's something a council should be looking at.
I'll leave it there, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
If I could just ask a supplementary question to that, do we have any estimate of the number of coal fires that we have in Auckland, or if there are still any coal-fired boilers in Auckland?
Through the chair, the information that I believe we've been given is by our subject matter experts, some of whom are here today actually, who can probably answer the question much better than me, was when, in terms of the work that's been done about the particulates in Auckland's atmosphere, the proportion coming from coal is very small. It's something like less than 1%. I think it's 0.3% from memory, although I have to get someone to check that. So, sure, it is an issue, but in the big picture, in the regional picture, it's not a huge issue, although it could be addressed. Its main issue, is what I understand from advice that has been provided through the process, is that it creates local problems. It's a local issue for people next door who are next to people who are burning coal in a multi-fuel fire, for argument's sake. It's something that council could think about in the future, but in terms of its contribution to the air quality problem overall, it is relatively small.
Okay. Thank you very much. Councillor Newman.
Thank you. Firstly, can I say, very good, well-written report. I thought well-written. But I say that very often. But I have a question with respect to Clause 6, the use of indoor domestic fires in Auckland general conditions. Reading through that, it stipulates a number of things that owners of these domestic wood burners will not do. My issue is that the bylaw doesn't contain a power of entry, so I'm wondering how that particular clause is enforced if you don't have powers of entry to the domestic wood burner.
Through the chair, that enforcement issue was raised at several points in the process, including earlier meetings, and also in the we had taken advice. The enforcement officers had provided advice to the hearing panel and to us as officers about this. Their advice is that yes, they are aware that they cannot go into a property uninvited. They can ask to go in, and they can be refused. But the advice from the enforcement officers to the hearing panel and to us has been that they, wherever possible, they asked for the household to talk about the fireplace. Sometimes they're invited in, sometimes not. And the enforcement officers continue to work on to liaise with households and on an educational approach wherever possible. I don't know if we've got anyone from enforcement here today, but they have advised us that they work proactively with households if they see that there's a problem, and that there has been some success in that regard.
Okay, I've got another question, because that really, I mean, that's the soft stuff, and I think that's good. But the Part 3 contains the enforcement offences and penalties provision, which are serious. If you are not in compliance with the bylaw and you are at risk of incurring an offence, denying entry to the property would seem like a logical thing to do in order to circumvent the risk of incurring an offence and penalty under the bylaw. So it seems to me we've got a bylaw now which can't be enforced because of the lack of powers of entry. I don't know how the bylaw can be enforced beyond trying to negotiate and get an agreement from the property owner to access the site where the domestic wood burner is located. I don't know how you address that. Mr. Barnes and the compliance staff aren't here, so I'm unclear as to how they will actually enforce it beyond a request to enter the site.
So, through the chair, so my understanding is a graduated approach. That's how it is couched.
Yep.
That's the advice that's been provided. There have been, over the last, I think, 10, 11 years since the air and water plan was put in place, 7 years, sorry, there were a couple of prosecutions considered, as in repeat offenders. I believe that there were a couple of occasions which were fairly serious, but the council itself decided not to proceed with prosecution. They continued working with the property owners.
I think we've arrived at an impasse, so I'll leave it there and
Can I just comment on Councillor
Quacks.
Councillor Newman's question? We did hear of cases where officers had been called to properties, and really what the finding was that I don't think that anybody out there is deliberately burning some of these prohibited substances. It's more a matter of not understanding or not knowing that they are, say, burning treated timber or whatever. What we heard was that people who seem to be in breach of the bylaws are quite willing to cooperate and do understand that there's things that they can't burn. So I think it's a matter of really being cooperative, Councillor Newman, and not coming down heavily on people and people understanding what they can burn in their fires.
Katarina, you've come here with a sense of purpose. Would you like to comment on that?
He has the power of entry.
Just through the chair, Councillor Newman's correct. This will be very, very difficult to enforce. It's difficult to enforce under the Resource Management Act. It's emissions out of chimney stacks or smokestacks are an issue that enforcement officers all over New Zealand grapple with. I know in the South Island they've thought about infrared devices which they can try and put up against smokestacks, but it is one of those very, very difficult things to enforce, and mostly, you're right, we have to take the more educational approach. So you're right, you've been right from the beginning when you've asked these questions previously. It is just very difficult, and I confirm that with Max, who undertakes enforcement, that getting beyond the education and voluntary part is very, very difficult.
Can I ask a question to follow that up? In the cases of persistent offenders where you've sought to work with them educationally, did you in the end succeed, or did they and are they continuing to offend?
So in many other places where we've undertaken this kind of work, there are larger non-regulatory programs in place which they spend quite substantial amounts of money incentivising changes from certain types of non-clean heat to clean heat. They actually run bigger education campaigns with the public, so you have other non-regulatory tools that are reinforcing that.
So
we don't have those other non-regulatory tools currently in our toolbox.
So is the answer that they did continue to, with the behaviour that would be prohibited under this bylaw, or did they cease it on the basis of whatever mechanisms of encouragement? I mean, presumably the people burning that would be the primary victims of the residue that they'd be breathing in, but I'm trying to find out whether there is an actual problem. Yep. It's a big step to have power of entry in any regard, but if you've got persistent and serious offending and we can't bring sanctions on it, then we would have to consider options. And I'm asking, are we in that situation?
Yes, we would be in that situation. Previously, under the regional plan, we have taken no prosecutions, so nothing got to the threshold where we thought we could go to court and win the case. So
That was because of lack of evidence, because you weren't able to measure the emissions, was it?
it's because of a whole range of factors, but that is a key one.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Simpson.
You've sort of, it's interesting, I should follow the questioning from yourself and Councillor Newman and Councillor Quacks, because I can't see the point of passing a bylaw that you can't enforce. That's my first question. And my second question is, I would like to think in my charitable way that actually 99.999% of people who actually have an indoor fire I would be very pleased to know that they can keep their current fire, so therefore would be willing to make sure that what was burnt in that fire was the right thing. And sometimes it's just ignorance. So I suppose for me, rather than passing a bylaw that can't be enforced and trying to, you know, be a fire Nazi or whatever, is actually about having quite a good communications plan for the people that we know have these things, and just saying, look, you're really lucky because council's not forcing you to get rid of it, but what we do need you to do is make sure that what you burn is this, that and the other, because. And I think that's probably a better way to go in the first instance, because this is just a complete waste of time if it can't be enforced, isn't it?
It may not be a complete waste of time, but it may not be a perfect answer, and I feel a little uneasy if there are people that cannot be persuaded to act in the good of the community if they're able to continue to thumb their nose at something that is a prohibited practice. And it would be my desire not to hold up putting this in place, because having this in place is better than not having it in place, but to have further consideration by officials on the scale of the problem and whether that merits a stronger enforcement power. You know, we've got a very heavy fine that's set out there. If I recall rightly, it was about $20,000. But if you've got people that are simply thumbing their nose and saying, I'll continue to burn high sulphur coal and tannalised timber, even when they've had it explained to them what the consequences are, we would want to do something about that.
Yep.
But so I'm really foreshadowing in relation to the questioning that Councillor Newman has commenced, that we should be asking you to do some more work on that, not with the intent of holding this resolution up today, but considering the options. Anyway, I'll continue to take further questions and comments on this. Councillor Wayne Walker.
Sure, just got a couple of questions. In the panel's considerations, did we look at the experience of other councils, and I'm thinking in terms of Christchurch and I think Nelson, that have taken a more aggressive stance on this issue to reduce their emissions? And did we take into account the experience and the success that they've had around that, and how that would apply to Auckland?
Through the Chair, the advice that some of the issues that were discussed in the hearing panel, hearings and deliberations, was some of these other initiatives, such as the Nelson Goodwood scheme, because of the issue of complementary measures and other measures, non-regulatory and other measures, came up a fair bit. And one of the issues that the hearing panel in particular noted was, you know, how can we do something like the Nelson Goodwood scheme, where good quality dry wood is kind of in some way endorsed by the council, not financially, I mean somehow recognised, or, you know, that the council actually send signals to people about where they can get really good wood and what it looks like and what it means. So that's one of the things that the hearing panel in particular raised, and there were other issues, other examples. But in terms of the advice that was provided to the hearing panel about other measures, like more the measures, say, environment, Canterbury, this proposal itself, the proposal in this bylaw, haven't put in place those additional measures because we're putting in place our baseline rules, but some of the non-regulatory issues, measures used elsewhere, were discussed in the deliberations and hearings, and the hearing panel had different views about that.
So, just to clarify then, so our bylaw isn't as stringent as, say, Nelson or Christchurch in terms of reducing emissions? Is that the case?
That's through the chair, that's correct.
And are there other councils that have more stringent bylaws than this?
Yeah, through the chair, yes, there are. There are. Christchurch is a good example because it has such significant air pollution. Rotorua Lakes District was another one where there were much more aggressively phasing out old fireplaces. There are other parts in New Zealand too.
So just a further question. So, across the spectrum, would we be on the worst end or the best end?
I'll answer that, Councillor. I think we need to think about the response being proportionate to the problem. So in Christchurch, in Rotorua, they have a major air quality problem. At times in Rotorua, the air quality was as poor as it was in China, and they have taken actions that are proportionate to the number of tonnes of emissions they need to get out of the atmosphere, where for us in Auckland, we have been compliant now with the National Environmental Standard for 3 years. And so we are in a place where we're not needing that level of action yet. The other complicating factor Auckland has is in places like Rotorua and Christchurch, the by far largest portion of emissions to air are clearly from domestic fires. But with Auckland's level of population and emissions from vehicles, we have done work which we've presented to councillors previously, which showed that you could ban all fires in Auckland and we would still have a large issue in terms of vehicle emissions.
Exactly.
So this is at the stage where Auckland's air pollution issue is at. This is a response to keep the baseline rules you had before. Yes, they're not perfect because they're very, very difficult to enforce, but they are proportionate at this point to, we would say, the problem Auckland has.
I guess my question was around where council is at on the spectrum. So let's put proportionality to one side, in terms of other councils and what they're doing and their bylaws. Just where do we sit? I mean, I can answer that question. My understanding is that we're...
Go away, we don't need you.
That was the answer I was after.
Got the wrong
So
job, Wayne.
let's not go there. The other question I've got
We can save money.
Well, I like to cut to it sometimes, Councillor Clow. The other question I've got is just around products that have got a high glue content. Does the bylaw cover those off?
Solvents.
Yeah, through the chair, yes, that is covered off in that clause, part of clause 6, which is about the things you can't burn, include rubbish and waste, green waste and rubbish, a whole range of things that we can, I can't remember, I've got reading without my glasses here, but all those things that burning refuse on your fire is not permitted because of the plastics and the things that come out when you burn plastics and so on. It's one of the things that's really a really bad contributor to smoke and contaminants.
So, just for some clarity there, it mentions solvents. Would that include glues? I'm just looking at Part 262D.
Yep. I'm not exactly sure, to be honest, Councillor, but I would think so. But I'd have to get confirmed by someone in the enforcement team, to be honest. I would think so because solvents is a sort of a generic term, but I'd have to get someone in the air quality enforcement team to confirm that.
Yeah, well, I just signal I've just got a concern around that because there are a number of wood products that have substantial glue content.
Thank you very much. Councillor Mike Lee.
Thank you. I note that 5,639 additional properties have been brought in to the ambit of this proposed bylaw, including Waiheke and even Rakino Island. Thank you, Councillor Quacks. It's asserted here that there's been significant urban development in these areas, Franklin, Henderson, Massey, Rodney, etc., and quite right, but not on Waiheke. There's to be no new areas opened up for development on Waiheke, and because of the septic tank system, there hasn't been the intensification that was seen on the mainland. So I would query that, and I also would have to query why Rakino Island, probably the most isolated part of the region, is now considered urban.
Yeah, that's good. Through the Chair, the advice that we were given to the hearing panel on this, which we discussed, the hearings deliberations, I believe, was that firstly, Waiheke Island, parts of Waiheke Island were in the Auckland Equality Management Area under the regional plan. They always were, because of the urban parts of Waiheke, the urban parts, not all of it.
Always were, maybe a year or so, to be honest.
2010, that's when the regional plan applied. So there were parts of Waiheke that were always part of that urban equality management area, which we have reinstated. There are a couple of, as you commented, the report notes the 5,600 properties around the region, including around the urban-rural boundary. But when we have redefined the urban equality, we looked at urban zones, of which there are residential zones, of which there are some on Rakino Island. But I also...
To be honest, that's frankly ridiculous.
Sorry, can we just let the officials finish without interruption?
And I'd also like to comment that, as was discussed with the hearing panel, this urban equality area, the impact is that when someone in that area puts in a new or replacement fireplace, it has to meet the urban standard. That's what it's about. So whatever those areas have now, they carry on, subject to Clause 6, that is general conditions and considerate use of their fireplaces, good use of fireplaces. The thing that makes the difference is when they put in a new fireplace, because they're quite close to other properties, they have to meet the urban emission standard for the new fireplace. That's what that's about.
Thank you. Councillor Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I mean, this is a difficult issue because we canvassed it in the last term and it caused huge upset to people that we might ban fireplaces. So I think we've kind of landed here on a middle ground, but I also have to agree that we do have quite a few bylaws that are difficult to enforce. And so the Regulatory Committee have adopted a framework to guide staff that the highest harm gets the most attention, because that's all we can do, basically. But also, just to back up, that this is a framework that maybe not going and ticketing people doing that, but it actually sets a standard that when we do have people, you know, at that 1% or whatever it is that Councillor Simpson talks about are offenders, the rest are pretty good, is that we've got the ability for our staff to actually go in and do something. If we had nothing, people could get away with anything they like. So we have to send a message, but we also have to have a framework to educate people. And I think this is what it does. It's not everything that maybe Councillor Darby wants, and it would be fantastic to get rid of all harmful particulates, but I think we get most of them from our transport. So I support the work that's been done, but just as an addition to this, I want to acknowledge Councillor Quacks, because he's also at the same time been interviewing for RMA commissioners, so he's done a huge amount of work, and not many councillors are willing to do that, so I acknowledge Councillor Quacks for doing that, but also the other members of the panel, because it was really, really hard to get people to commit. And so I just acknowledge those people for making that time. And there'll be other people I want to acknowledge when we get other things coming. Well, actually, no, we won't get it coming to us as the District Licensing Commissioner work and the RMA Commission interviews, because there's been a very small pool of councillors who have been willing to commit to this, and I just want to acknowledge them and thank you for their work.
Thank you, councillor. Finally, councillor Clow.
Did I not make it onto?
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I've
sorry.
been waiting as a panel member to make a comment.
Oh, this is just for questions.
That's
Oh.
okay. I'd just
thought it
like
was
to
part
ask.
of-
I'll
was
come
on
to
the
comments in a
table
moment. Councillor.
It was just in response to a question raised, but I'll wait.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
go ahead.
Well, why don't you take it if it's in
It
relation
might-
to something
it might
that's been
actually
there?
just help.
We can talk about it.
Councillor Hulse.
Thank you,
Thank
Mr
you.
Mayor, thank you. Again, just echoing the respect and thanks to Councillor Quacks for superb chairing of this, and to our staff who did very good work. The issue that I want to raise is the non-regulatory side of things. I don't think we've quite covered that enough, and it's an issue that I'm undertaking to pick up in the Environment and Community Committee, and it picks up a bit of what Councillor Darby raised at the beginning. We certainly spent a huge amount of the deliberation time going through the public health submission from Auckland Public Health, so those issues you raised have been clearly canvassed, and we've got the ability in a non-regulatory area through the Environment and Community Committee to pick those up. Councillor Walker, looking at best practice around the country, again, we can pick those non-regulatory issues up as we enact our carbon reduction strategy and our clean air plan. So we're going to work with the staff in this area to pick those up. It doesn't have to be through a bylaw. And finally, you know, I know that this might feel that why do a bylaw when you can't go and enforce it? When you live on Rakino Island, and you have a neighbour who is within touching distance of your house, and we studied the maps very carefully for Rakino Island and Waiheke, those people have every right to not have a neighbour burning high sulphur content coal or MDF board or tannalised timber as anyone else does, and when you live in a village environment like that, they need our protection as well. So that's why those areas have been brought into the air quality shed. So, Mr Mayor, thank you for the indulgence, and just to let people rest assured, we don't have to pack everything into the bylaw. We will be picking this up in a really proactive way with our staff through the Environment and Community Committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Hulse. Councillor Clow.
Well, it's comforting to know in our letter of expectation to Auckland Council Investments regards the airport that we asked them to, reduce their admissions by cutting the number of airlines visiting, presumably, and cutting the number of flights. Yeah, right, that will never happen. So, the coal, I have questions. With the coal, can we remind or can we enforce with retailers that they have to sell the coal at the correct sulphur level? I mean, we're talking generally petrol stations and the large hardware superstores that seem to be the main sellers.
Through the chair, I as an implementation issue, I can't make a lot of comment on that. I'd have to get some from the enforcement people to comment on that. But my assumption is that we would be able to, since it will be a regional regulation. So.
Katarina, you might like to comment further on that?
The answer to that is no. We cannot enforce this with retailers.
So it seems all a bit pointless in many ways, isn't it? Because they just...
However, we can do complementary, non-regulatory discussions with retailers about this, but we cannot enforce retail regulatory standards. It's not within our remit, that's within governments.
Okay, so, okay.
Councillor Clow, further questions?
Yeah. Sorry, you mentioned before that when it comes to new houses being built, part of the consents, obviously they cannot put in heating unless it's meeting the new regulations. So when there is a resale of a older house, does that get registered? I'm sorry, I'm quite ignorant. Does that get registered through council? Or is it really the responsibility only for the buyer to look at the LIM report to see if there are any restrictions on the LIM report? And that leads into it, can we put it on the LIM report?
Through the Chair, Councillor, can you just put it, meaning the fireplace? Is that
Yeah,
what you're referring to?
yeah.
The age of the fireplace?
Well, we just, on all limbs, it would say that this house cannot be sold, cannot be resold without the implementation of an appropriate fireplace.
Okay. Are you? My understanding of the question is that would be like the point of sale rule that would have, but that was something that was discussed in the previous work.
Yeah.
This bylaw doesn't include that particular measure. This is basically if someone buys and sells and buys a house with an older fireplace, they just carry on using it as they were. The point of sale rule is not included in this bylaw. So older fireplaces carry on being used as they are until they're replaced, and that's when, the property owner replaces or upgrades the heating. That's when they go through the building consent process for the new fireplace, and the new standards would then apply. Okay. So it's like the natural attrition of that household infrastructure.
Okay. And I would just like to pass an acknowledgement to Callum Penrose for the work that he did prior to this that led to us ditching it last time because common sense prevailed over open fires, among other things. But we went back to the drawing board, so mention that.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Just before I go on for any, we've actually merged probably questions and general comment, but I will give anybody else a chance to make a general comment. With the approval of the mover and the seconder, I've just added a recommendation E, and the reason that I've singled that out, I think if we're seen to pass a bylaw and somebody just continually thumbs their nose at it, resists any opportunity to listen to the educative approach we take, and we are toothless in terms of enforcing it, I think that brings us into disrepute. Right. So I'm making this request because I don't think council can afford to have repeat offenders burning obnoxious materials keeping on doing that, and we can't respond in any way. So that's now on one of the recommendations. Further, we now move to the general comment section. Councillor Clow.
I'd like to comment on your addition there. Then why that is like hurting the consumer who may be ignorant, that pulls into the petrol station, sees a bag of wood and sees a bag of coal, puts them into the car. They go home and burn the coal. They're creating an offence, but the retailer is not creating an offence.
No.
So that seems blatantly unfair. So
Absolutely.
the people that are making the money on it, making the profit, are the people who dig it out of the ground where we want to leave it, and then we've got the retailer who sells it and makes a profit, and then the consumer gets pinged. Is blatantly unfair.
No, maybe if I can comment on that, Councillor. One, the wording is quite deliberate, repeat offending, so that if I accept your point that if an innocent person buys a bag of coal and burns it and doesn't know any better, yeah, we're not going to prosecute them. But we are going to do the process that we all already do. If we find out about it, draw it to their attention. I agree entirely with your comment that we should be following that same approach with retailers who are selling a product that cannot lawfully be burnt in the Auckland area. And I suppose the question that I had was not, I think with retailers, generally, if you tell them that is against the bylaw, they will generally withdraw the product. My question was, do we actually ever seek to enforce that requirement that they not sell a product that the burning of which would be in breach of our bylaw? Do we ever check coal outlets to see whether their product is compliant or not? Because I think that picks up your point, Councillor.
Yeah, well, I suppose what I'm thinking about is if we can add in there the repeat offending of retailers and consumers.
Bylaw doesn't apply to retailers.
I'm sorry, I haven't yet actually even had evidence that the retailer might be offending or that there are repeat offenders amongst retailers. So that's why I'm reluctant to put that in until I know it is a problem. But maybe officials could comment on that too. Well, I don't know the answer to that. I'm asking.
Yep. So through the Mayor, this is an answer to the question that you've just asked about retailing. So we, as I said previously, can't enforce this against retailers. One of the key mechanisms, though, that you can use with retailers that have been used quite successfully in other places is either mystery shopping. So you often do mystery shopping or sting exercises where you use that to educate the public about particular stores, particular products that actually, if you use them, would mean you're non-compliant with this bylaw, and that has been successful in other places. That is also done with wetwood, so mystery shopping, wetwood, you test it and you publish the results and you start raising public awareness about where to purchase these things, where not to, and brands to purchase or not.
Can I ask, is it an offence for a retailer to sell a product that it's illegal to burn? A product designed to be burnt, even though it's illegal to burn it. Is that covered by our bylaw? Is it an offence?
No, it is not, and it's not covered by the bylaw or the Resource Management Act.
Well,
our legislation given to us by government controls the person who uses the material in the home through the fireplace. It doesn't allow us to regulate the seller, so technically it's still a legal activity until government would ban the sale of, for example, high sulphur coal.
Are you saying that we have no ability under a bylaw to deal with the retailer in that instance?
Yes, that's what I am saying.
Well, what I might suggest to Councillor Clow is, and it doesn't need to be a formal resolution here, but we could draw that to the attention of the government, because it's patently ridiculous, as you've suggested, that we would take action against the person consuming the product if the person was legally selling the product. So I take your point in answer to that question. Right, any further comment on this? Councillor Darby.
Look, it may not come as any surprise. I won't be supporting this, these motions before us. I've been consistent in this since when Councillor Penrose was looking at this, and I've had discussions with the staff. I don't think this is ambitious at all. I don't actually think, Mr Chair, it reflects the purpose of the bylaw, and the purpose is about air quality, improving air quality. The purpose is about promote, protect human health and protect from nuisance, and the words go on. And I did ask the question about whether this reduces the number of premature deaths from particulate that it is generated from domestic fires. It's 110, and the answer is no. So the 110 carries on, and this week everybody's lighting up their fires, and if anybody looked at Auckland from the Bombay Hills or a high point, on Monday morning you would have seen an inversion layer of smog generated from the particulate.
Oh, rubbish. From cars.
Cars.
Sorry, I just keep getting this echo.
It's impolite to interject on a speaker when they're speaking, even if you disagree with them. Councillor Darby, you've got the floor.
So the temperature dropped 2 degrees overnight, which was unseasonable low for Auckland, but this is we've canvassed this before, that's when people are at high risk, when that inversion layer occurs. No wind, the southwesterly that cleans Auckland, supposedly, is not with us. That's when the risk is there for human health for 1.5 million Aucklanders, and 110 of them. Now, these are not messy car crashes that feature on our front pages. I think approximately about 170 people die from car crashes in the Auckland region, and we make a lot of fuss about that. It's on the front page, and it's top of our mind when we talk transport, but 110 premature deaths from the inhalation of particulates is something that we should have been addressing, and we're not addressing, not through this bylaw. There's been some discussion about coal and the lack of ability to enforce it. There is nothing on a coal packet that you'll find at Bunnings, the service station, or anywhere where you might buy that packet that indicates what the sulphur content is, or what the origin of that coal was, whether it be lignite from Southland, which is probably the best coal for burning, or bituminous coal or subbituminous coal. There's nothing there at all. Lignite has the lowest sulphur content, and it starts at 0.4, but then goes up. The other coals are out of range. They're well beyond the 0.5 that are covered by this bylaw. But the retailers won't be looking at that. There's no teeth in that. And we know that coal is a a small contributor to the particulate output, but it's the deadly contributor to the particulate output because of the size of the particulate. It generates the particulate which lodges in the lungs and won't leave. And I'm sure the Auckland Regional Public Health Service conveyed all of this, but it hasn't really been taken into account. I am not here criticising my colleagues who sat on this or the staff. I am here because it's a point of interest that I've looked into, and I would like to see this council make a much greater stand on addressing the 110 premature deaths of Aucklanders year in, year out, year in, year out. And this bylaw does not do that. Last Monday, 2 degrees, there was a massive inversion layer. That inversion layer was there before the traffic started. I was on a hill looking out at that inversion layer when the light came up at 10 to 7, and it was from the particulate generated that previous evening from a very cold evening, and where people were firing up their fires. So, Mr. Chair, I'm just saying we're not doing enough here. We're not even coming near. This is a kicked for touch bylaw. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Glenn Wilcox, you wanted to make a comment before?
Yes,
Sorry.
it's really about E, and the terms of reference for this bylaw came from the community, from the regulatory and bylaws. Would you not have that reporting back to that group, notwithstanding the governing body's right to ask for anything it likes?
I'm happy to that may be the appropriate group for it to go back to. I've used the term council as a wide generic term. I was wondering whether I'd be environment and community or the group that looked at it. I've left it wide open, so that could be taken on board. Councillor Watson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Councillor Darby's right. This bylaw represents a fairly significant compromise. However, for those councillors that were involved in the last term that went some way down with a potentially more demanding bylaw, it pretty quickly became evident that while clean air was a major concern, so was warm homes, and the unfortunate reality became very quickly apparent that for a disturbing number of Aucklanders that there would have been far more health implications with a more stringent bylaw approach than the alternative, and that hasn't changed. If anything, that's got worse over the last little while, as we can all attest to when we look at the poor souls trying to keep themselves warm all across different parts of Auckland. We do have models in this country that are shining beacons of success, and the Environment Canterbury Clean Heat Project was one of those. They originally did confront a lot of opposition and public angst, but they had a bigger problem to deal with to begin with, but they engage, and I know Katarina's made reference to this, on a fairly extensive public education program to begin with. They ended up, and the Mayor might be interested in this, actually introducing a special targeted rate, which amounted to a fairly substantial amount of money, $58 million over a 10-year period, and 70% of the people paying that rate would derive no benefit from it. However, there was eventually a buy-in, and our number one concern that emerged in the last term was indeed the health of people who couldn't afford any other type of heating. In the case of Canterbury, they addressed that. They addressed that in a comprehensive and fair manner, which ranged from full subsidies to partial subsidies to landlord subsidies to loans, depending on people's financial situation. So via that kind of very determined and costly way, they covered that clean air component, but more importantly, the warm home component of it too. I don't know what our stomach is for pursuing a similar approach. I would suspect in the current financial circumstances in terms of raising extra revenue and targeted rates, and ability to subsidise those who need it, we might not be as good a place as we would need to be. I hope we can go some way to doing that, but I guess when it's said and done, for myself anyway, that notion of warm homes is as important as the clean air, and in this respect, this compromise appears to be the most acceptable form of going forward at the moment.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Mike Lee. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This version, I guess, is more reasonable than the earlier one that the governing body rejected, I think, back in 2013. I have been involved with the matter of air quality for some years as a member of the former regional council. The regional council, for the most part, took an even-handed, effects-based approach to air pollution and focused very heavily on vehicle pollution, and was involved with a campaign with the former Labour-led government to get the standard of diesel, which was appalling, the refined standard of diesel upgraded to international best practice standards, and that certainly achieved the improvements that are alluded to in this report. However, we still have a major air pollution problem in parts of the city from vehicle emissions, especially this part of the city. And my concern with the council's approach is that it is one-sided and unbalanced, and focusing on individual householders is inequitable. The figures of 110 premature deaths have been proposed here, and I'm not going to challenge that. But the assumption, the non-scientific aspect of it all, is to blame that all on domestic fires, which is, to me, absurd. No mention at all of vehicle emissions. The difference between the effects, the environmental effects of domestic fires, is that they tend to be used in winter at night when people are not outside. Vehicle emissions go on every day, and particularly in the inner city where people congregate. So the health effects are, on the face of it, far more significant, or potentially more significant, from vehicle emissions than from domestic fire emissions. In fact, there has been scientific studies done on the impact of the level of pollution from diesel emissions in the CBD, and this council has studiously ignored those studies and done nothing about it. I'm concerned about being overzealous and focusing on one aspect of the community, and being seen to be heavy-handed on targeting one aspect of the community and leaving out, if it comes to coal, so you can be in breach of the bylaw for using coal that's sold legally, and we say nothing about that. That's not particularly fair, and it won't be seen to be fair. The targeting of domestic fires means that people are likely to become even more vulnerable to the health effects of cold and damp houses, and seems to be no concern about that. So if you're going to make law, it needs to be fair and measured and objective and respected by the community, because it is fair. And putting Rakino in as an urban area just indicates that the effects are not being taken into account, and that the council runs a risk of being seen to be heavy-handed. all we are doing really is driving our citizens away from domestic fires and reliance on the privately owned electricity utilities. If we're going if we're serious about air pollution, we really need to tackle the main offender, and that is vehicle emissions. But the council is curiously silent when it comes to taking on the big people in our society, but seems to be quite willing to take on the little citizen.
Thank you,
my
Councillor.
concern.
Councillor Newman.
Thank you, Your Worship. Look, I want to echo what Member Cooper has said regarding the work of the panel here. It is a difficult exercise, and despite everything, I acknowledge the work of the panellists and the officers for the work that they have done. Your Worship, I kind of, some months ago, I sort of felt a bit sort of Cassandra, that nobody would sort of pick up on some of these issues that I was raising. I thought I'll be out there on my own again. But I think that a number of points have been conceded, and I appreciate that. Notwithstanding acknowledgement of that, the bylaw in its current form isn't one for me, so I will be voting against that, and if that could be recorded, Mr Chair. Councillor Wayne Walker raised the issue of will glue products be covered with respect to clause 6(2)(d). Well, the answer is that actually we'll probably never know, because there's no powers of entry to be able to enforce the bylaw as it is set out in the agenda. I think that Your Worship, has been answered with respect to the scale of repeat offending, because we haven't had any prosecutions. Well, it depends how you interpret the question, but there haven't been prosecutions as far as I know. There's been a graduated process, and there has been, I suspect, some difficult conversations, but a very difficult one to enforce. Your Worship, I do note one of the gaps that I think that we have in our bylaw making process is that we don't appear to require a local government equivalent of a regulatory impact statement. In a central government, you'd have a regulatory impact statement. It would be an agent document, and it would address a range of matters. You could say, well, the statement of proposal addresses that, but we haven't actually addressed the two things that a regulatory impact statement would require, which would be the implementation and how the impact of the proposal will be monitored. And of course, we've learnt that, in fact, in terms of monitoring, it'll be a tough one to monitor because we don't have the powers of entry. The other thing I would say, Your Worship, with respect to this, is that one of the reasons why I'm not particularly concerned if we don't have a bylaw in place is that we already have the National Wood Burner Standards, and they are set out in Attachment B, and I think that they have been successful. Evidence with the migration to more efficient domestic wood burners as technology improves. So I'm actually comfortable that we had the regulatory tools in place, and that we have improvements in the area of the operation of domestic wood burners. So, look, I think it's a well-written report. I think it's a complex issue. I wasn't here during the last term. I can only really sort of go on what I've seen and been party to in terms of debate and conversation since I've been here. But for me, I actually don't think that adopting a bylaw that you really can't enforce because of the lack of the enforcement, lack of entry to actually get to the domestic wood burner, given that it's in a domestic space, means the gap undermines the credibility of the bylaw, and so I'll be voting against it.
Thank you. Last speaker, Councillor Wayne Walker. Sorry, Dick Quacks
Speak after.
at the end. Yeah.
Sure. I'll be voting against this as a matter of principle. I helped lead out some of the issues on air quality in my first term on council, and we had some pretty comprehensive reports on the number of premature deaths in Auckland from all the various particulates, and it's of really grave concern, especially when we've got a city that's intensifying, the consequence of which is you're going to have more people potentially exposed, and the consequences are also aggravated because we know, because of the housing crisis that we have, that there are likely to be more people being exposed to particulates emissions, especially in some parts of Auckland. What was identified in earlier committees was the need for a comprehensive approach, rather than the sort of approach that we're taking here, where we're not taking a firm enough line on regulation, and we're not supporting in terms of some carrots and some effort to actually effect that change, especially for poor families. So this is a really serious issue. We should be acting on all fronts much more comprehensively than we are. We're dropping the ball here, and we're not acting as aggressively as other cities in New Zealand, or for that matter elsewhere. So that's my concern. We need a comprehensive approach, and we're not doing that.
Thank you, Councillor. Just before I call on Councillor Quacks, Councillor Clow indicated a willingness to speak.
Just to follow up to Councillor Lee's points about motor cars, I find it quite amusing to hear Councillor Walker going to vote against you this and that. Next week he'll be voting for more car parks or retention of car parks to house cars, so cars can park and drive on the road and do exactly what Councillor Lee says. So I just pass that comment.
Thank you. I think, I'm sorry, I don't want to go down that track.
Excuse me, Mr Mayor, do I have any opportunity to respond to
because
Councillor Clow's allegations against me?
It is possible to raise a debating point. It's not always wise to do it, but you do not have a right of reply to somebody else's debating point if you've spoken already. Order, please. I think we best leave that to one side, and we come to Councillor Quacks in reply.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's interesting because we just heard two totally opposing points of view from Councillor Walker and Councillor Newman, but they're both going to vote against it. I've got to say, I did find that somewhat ironic.
I'm nervous.
But a couple of issues in terms of the retailers selling wet wood, for example. That was raised by Councillor Clow and was also commented on by you, Mr. Mayor. What's wrong with that? We don't know when the person who buys that wood is going to actually burn it. It could be very well, they could sit it under the house for the next 3 years and it will be very dry. But I just want to say to those who wish to oppose this, just be mindful of those poor and elderly people who have as their only method of heating their home, maybe one room in the house, is an open fire or one of the old fireplaces. And so what you are doing, and many of you who have constituents who are in this place. And we had this debate some years ago on the previous council, and the uproar, as Councillor Watson correctly pointed out from our community, was quite remarkable, because people understand that they want to be warm in winter. They don't want to be filling up the halls of the local hospitals when they're overcrowded by people with flus. And so we had to make, and this bylaw does that, a very pragmatic approach. And again, I understand the debate about this, and it was a good debate to be had, but I want to commend our staff who took part and advised the panel. And I want to again thank Member Wilcox and Councillor Hulse for the work they put into this. And I think that we arrived at a pretty good place. It's not ideal. I think the number E on the order paper that adds to that, and I will support that absolutely. But I would ask councillors, in the interest of your constituents, who will face huge power bills if they're suddenly told you can't use that fireplace any longer, which appears to be what some councillors here are asking. Think about those constituents of yours, and this is a practical bylaw. It doesn't have the teeth that Councillor Newman wants, and I understand that, and we will get a report back on that. So again, I would ask you to support this bylaw as a pragmatic step. And I would like to just point out, point 12, paragraph 12, Auckland's air quality has improved over the last 2 decades.
That's right.
Now, let's not forget about the fact that the graph of air pollution is on a downward slide, not on an upward slide. It's not getting worse, councillors, it's getting better.
Didn't need a bylaw.
Thank you very much, Councillor Quacks. Can I also thank Councillors Quacks, Hulse and Member Glenn Wilcox for the work they've put in, and the officials. I think it's been an interesting debate. It's not the first time you've had it around this table, and it probably won't be the last. And I take on board what Councillor Darby has said, that there is a remaining problem. This is a compromise solution, but I think it takes a step in the right direction. Councillor Quacks, we weren't planning to stop the sale of wood, wet or otherwise. It was coal, and if coal is over the level that's legal, then it is inconsistent. But I won't abuse my position to make a debating point. I think we're ready to vote on that. We can take the recommendations as a whole. It's been moved and seconded. All. You've called for a division, Councillor Quacks. Yeah. It's your entitlement to do that. So we will have a vote by division, and I'll ask our secretary to read the roll call.
Okay, councillors, you're voting on the recommendations in front of you. Mayor Goff.
4.
Councillor Clough.
Yes.
Councillor Collins.
4.
Councillor Cooper.
4.
Councillor Darby.
Against.
Councillor Filipina.
Aye.
Councillor Hills.
Yes.
Councillor Hulse.
Aye.
Councillor Denise Lee.
Or
Councillor Mike Lee.
Abstain.
Councillor Newman.
Against.
Councillor Quacks.
4.
Councillor Simpson.
or
Councillor Stewart.
or
Councillor Sir John Walker.
Or
Councillor Wayne Walker.
No.
Councillor Watson.
Yes.
It's carried.
I'll declare that those recommendations carried 13-3 with 1 abstention. Right, councillors, we come to item number 13.